Hello, and welcome to the 2020 North Carolina Bike Walk Transportation Summit. This presentation is Durham's Trail Implementation Plan. At a time of increased trail use due to the pandemic, trails are more important than ever to provide safe, recreational, and healthy living opportunities for residents. In 2011, Durham produced a Trails and Greenways Master Plan that recommended building 186 miles of paved and natural surface greenways, but the lack of details, along with no analysis of feasibility, has made it challenging to advance projects toward construction. Hence, the need for an implementation plan. In this presentation, we will see the steps that the City of Durham is taking to move projects toward design and to define a targeted program of trail development. The focus on implementation makes this plan a unique product in North Carolina, essentially conducting multiple feasibility studies as part of one planning process. Our presenters will be Matt Hayes and Lindsay Smart. Matt is a vice president at Alta Planning Plus Design and brings over 20 years of experience leading multimodal transportation and greenway planning efforts across North Carolina and the Southeast. As a recognized leader in the bicycle and pedestrian planning field, he has laid the groundwork for communities both large and small to accommodate sustainable modes of transportation. Lindsay Smart is a senior planner with the City of Durham's Parks and Recreation Department. Lindsay is primarily responsible for the planning, implementation, and development of the city's trail network. Lindsay performs long-range master planning and site plan reviews for the city's parks and trail systems. She also works on capital improvement program projects and pursues funding opportunities for parks and trail projects. And now, to learn more about how these trails are going to get built, I turn the program over to Matt and Lindsay.
Well, thanks, Heidi. Great to be with you virtually here at the 2020 Walt Bike Summit, and just appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we've been doing with the City of Durham on their trail implementation plan, like Heidi mentioned. Just a brief outline of what we're going to be covering today. Just a brief snippet of what's happening with trails in 2020, just to kind of get our appetite for the rest of the presentation. Lindsay's going to talk a lot on what's going on with trails in Durham in terms of the history of trail planning, design, and development, and the reason really for doing this strategic Durham trail implementation plan. I'll get into a little more analysis or detail, I should say, on the project and the process itself, some of the work that we did to get to the study and to where we are today, where we have a draft plan completed. So, just a little bit of background. This has been a challenging year, I think, in more ways than one for so many of us. And in many ways, it's helped us to also realize the importance of things like trails in our communities. And I personally have seen trail use increase in my neighborhood. And if there's anything that's done well in 2020, it's trails, just because it's created those spaces for people to have that socially distant exercise, recreation, quality of life, just that ability to get outside and have some healthy living. In Durham itself, we've seen a lot of trail use, and that's actually increased. So ITRI has a number of automated counters around the state on trails, and on the American Tobacco Trail, which is one of Durham's major trail spines running north-south along an old rail corridor from downtown, really all the way through Durham County to Chatham County and Wake County. On the I-40 bridge, which many of you have probably seen as you've driven underneath it, you can see that blue line shows historic trail use at an hourly volume. The red line shows what's happened in 2020 during that same time period. And we've seen spikes, double, triple, quadruple the amount of people that have been using the American Tobacco Trail, which is great. And I think, again, partly because as gyms have closed and other things have happened, this has been one of the few places people have been able to go and retreat and get exercise. So, that's kind of been our backdrop as we've been doing our plan. Here's, you can kind of see the Neuse River Greenway as well. Just another example over in Wake County and Raleigh, again, where trail use has been really astronomical. During this time period, we've seen a huge surge in bike sales, for example, and so many bike shops have have faced shortages in bikes. I don't know if you've experienced that as well. If you've been going to take your bicycle in for maintenance, you've had to wait a little bit longer. And again, just continues to show that increased demand of, what we're seeing across the state, really and across the country. And yeah, as I kind of close for, the intro on trails, I think it's important for everybody who hasn't seen this process to go to the Great Trail State Plan website. You should be able to just type that in, Great Trail State, North Carolina, to be able to go to the website and learn more about it. The vision for trails connecting all 100 counties in North Carolina, and many, many trails of coming through Durham, including the American Tobacco Trail being part of that. So as I turn it over to Lindsay to talk about trails in Durham, I think we started this project in 2019, long before we had any notion of a pandemic. And in many ways, we knew it was important. We wanted to advance trails in Durham and continue to grow the system for both transportation and recreation. I don't think we realized just how important they would be, as we've seen over this past year, and even more important going forward for the quality of life and the health and well-being of our citizens. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay to talk about trails in Durham.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Heidi. Thanks for having me here today and as part of this summit. Excited to be here and to talk about trails in Durham. And most people are familiar with the American Tobacco Trail. It runs through Durham. We have about 25 miles of it. The other most popular trail that we have here in Durham is the Ellerby Creek Trail, and we've added a few extensions to that historically. But we still have a lot of catching up to do. And Matt very nicely put together this slide and then sent it to me. And I had a little bit of a shock when I saw how far behind we are compared to some of our neighbors here in the Triangle. This is a little slice of humble pie, if you will. But we're working on it. And one of the, this really does tell a good story. One of the reasons that we were able to get funding for the trail implementation program that we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute was because of these numbers, because we are so drastically behind Raleigh and Chapel Hill and Cary for a number of reasons. And it's not just the pursuit of federal funding or putting local funding in the CIP to build trails, but Raleigh, Chapel Hill, and Cary all do different things with the development review process and what they require of developers and how they have a very diverse toolkit for how they get trails built. And Durham has historically just pursued federal funding to build our trails, and we've started diversifying our toolkit, if you will, diversifying the way that we approach getting trails built. Our first trail was the Ellerby Creek Trail, and it was constructed in 1985. And then our most recent trail was the West Ellerby Creek Trail extension, or phase 2, which was completed in 2018. So that's 33 years between the construction of our first trail and our most recent trail, which comes out to be, and we have 31.8 miles of trail total, comes out to be just over 1 mile of trail per year, which explains why we're so drastically behind our neighbors here in the Triangle. And so with those 2 slides of bad news or humble pie, we decided to take a look at the 2011 Trails and Greenways Master Plan and take a good hard look at that plan and the recommendations in that plan and figure out what were some challenges to getting, why are we so challenged with getting trails built? And after we took a good hard look at that, we partnered with the Durham Open Space and Trails Commission and procured the development of the priority trail brochure. One of the first things that we realized in that 2011 master plan was there weren't any priorities. There wasn't a short list of trails that Durham should pursue. And so in 2014, I think, we had the priority trail brochure developed and identified 5 priority trails, and it did a little minor implementation study of each trail. And it was a brochure, a marketing brochure to kind of announce the next 5 priorities for the city of Durham. And that cost the city $25,000 to create. But with that priority trail brochure and identifying those priorities and having more specific information about the 5 priority trails, we were able to submit 2 of those trails to NCDOT spot prioritization process, and 2 of them were funded. And so a $25,000 investment moving from a long-range master plan towards implementation resulted in $4.5 million of federal competitive TAP funding being awarded to 2 of those trails. So then continuing on our efforts, our strategic efforts, while we're pursuing funding for design and acquisition and construction of new trails, we started to hear from a lot of people and some of our partners like BPAC and Bike Durham and DOS about the need for trail maintenance. And they said, well, the West Ellerby Creek Trail that was just completed in 2018 looks great, but some of your other trails are almost unusable at this point because they're in such disrepair. And so we procured a trail condition assessment that we had a consultant team inventory and assess all existing, the 31.8 miles of existing trail in Durham, and give us a report card on how we're doing. And so we are moving forward with about $3.5 million for trail repair to bring the existing network of the existing trail network up to a better standard so that people feel safe and can enjoy the existing trails as we can continue to pursue funding and continue to develop more new trails. We also talking about Cary and Raleigh and Chapel Hill and their diverse toolkit and how they get trails built, and they don't just have one method of pursuing federal funding, but they do lots of different things to have trails built in their communities. One of the things that Raleigh recommended to us a few years ago was to develop some typical standards like design specs for our trails, so that when we require a developer to build a section of trail and the developer says, can I just build a 5-foot wide mulch trail? We actually say, no, we're talking about a 10-foot wide shared use trail. And we have these typical sections that are now published on the City of Durham Public Works Construction Standard website, and we can refer people to. So now we're all talking the same language. And this is really important when we talk about developing future sections of trail and having developers do that as part of the development review and like site plan review and approval process. And so that leads us to the concept design for Kelly Bryant Bridge South. This was a quick sampling of what it would really feel like to have an implementation strategy for that master plan. We were able to get approved for funding from the City Council to develop this concept design, and Alta Planning and Design, Alta Engineering developed a concept design for Kelly Bryant Bridge South. It was a trail project that was from the master plan and had received funding in spot, I think P 3.0 federal funding. And then once we received the funding and we turned it over to General Services to manage the project, everyone said, well, this project is woefully underfunded and you're only about 50% funded. You're going to need twice as much funding to get this project built. And so we commissioned the concept design to identify alignment alternatives and other challenges to the construction process. And with the results of that construction of this concept design and having a real refined look at the corridor, we were able to send this concept design document to NCDOT, and they awarded another $780,000 to that project because we said, this project is really underfunded, but now we have a better idea of what it's going to take and what it's going to cost to get this project built. And they said, thank you for doing this now. Normally our policy is to wait until projects are at 60% design. And then with an updated cost estimate, we try to add more funding as needed to bring that project closer to being fully funded with TAP funding. But you having this report done and having all this information, we're able to give you the additional federal funding now so that we can go ahead and launch that project at a better position than it was being only 50% funded. And that takes us to the Durham Trail Implementation Program. So we have these success stories where we had the 5 priority trail brochure and the trail condition assessment, and then the concept design for Kelly Bryant Bridge South, that were all steps in the right direction to move that 2011 master plan towards implementation. And so it was time to go back to that 2011 master plan and take a real hard look at it and continue to figure out what were some of the challenges and why has Durham fallen so far behind Raleigh and Cary and Chapel Hill and our trail development. And we put together a committee to review that master plan with us and talk to project managers in the city of Durham and ask them why projects get stalled or what makes trail projects so expensive and what are some of the lessons learned and hurdles. And what we did was we put together this committee of project managers from Public Works, Water Management, Transportation, General Services, Parks and Recreation, City County Planning, the Durham Chapel Hill Carrboro MPO, City Attorney's Office, and Durham Open Space and Trails Commission are a really strong partner. And they've received updates and provided influence over the project throughout the life of the project. And the committee met several times to scope the Durham implementation program. Before we even released, an advertisement for the project and hired someone to do the project, this committee was meeting and scoping it and really putting together all the details that we needed to the consultants to evaluate for us. And so the plan really focuses on lessons learned that committee identified, and the 5 or 6 highest priorities for the scope of work were right-of-way acquisition, the process and the costs, design constraints, permitting challenges, and why stormwater infrastructure is so expensive, and impervious surface limitations on parcels in Durham, and the fact that we're in the Falls and the Jordan watershed, and we have those unique challenges locally here, which I don't know anything about, but all of the smart project managers in the city of Durham tried to explain to me on numerous occasions, but apparently that's a really big hurdle for us. And then cost estimates versus bids. We thought we had really great cost estimates, and then we'd bid the project and things would come back, as I said, almost twice as expensive as we thought. And so a lot of our projects were underfunded because our cost estimates were too low, and we were getting bids that were making these projects impossible to develop. And the final thing too is talking about diversifying that toolkit is a funding strategy. And as I said before a couple of times, the city of Durham has always pursued federal funding for our trail projects. And we've learned from our neighbors here in the Triangle that you need to have lots of different ways to get projects built and different funding strategies. And so maybe one trail won't be competitive for spot funding, but maybe it would be a good applicant for a different type of funding. Or maybe you do that with local funding, or you do it as a natural surface trail with some volunteers before you really get city funding for it. There's a lot of different ways to tackle these projects. Or you can have a developer build a section of it and then proffer it to the city to accept into maintenance. And so we're working on figuring out which trails would be competitive to put forth to NCDOT spot funding, and then which trails to figure out a different funding strategy for. So thanks. And with that, I'll turn it back to Matt.
Well, thanks, Lindsay. And she talks a little bit about humble pie, but there's a lot of good stuff going on in Durham, and Lindsay has really been at the forefront of a lot of that. And for those of you that haven't heard, the Durham Beltline is a project that is in the works as well. That's been a project that we've been wanting to see on the ground for years and years and years, and it's coming to fruition. It's going to be really a spectacular addition in the downtown of Durham to provide some connectivity throughout the downtown and through the communities. And so really excited to see the direction it's going. I'm a Durham resident, as is Lindsay, and I live near the American Tobacco Trail. And it's just amazing what it has done for our community here, and being able to access so many things. And so I think it's something that, we're really looking to grow and expand upon the spines that are in place now in Durham. And so, to kind of get into some of the overview and some of the nuts and bolts of the implementation plan, the project that we're currently working on and that Lindsay, described leading us up to, I'm going to basically cover these 3 steps. That we started doing a trail network review to begin with, that 2011 plan that Lindsay talked about. Try to review and update those lines in the map, as we like to call them, and put a little bit of realism to them. Then we started looking into some detail on the strategic corridors, priorities that we were moving forward, and some feasibility analysis, and then the implementation program document itself. So we'll start with trail network review. And I think really just to emphasize what Lindsay mentioned about our committee, Lindsay did a really great job of getting representatives from really all the key departments across the city that not only plan and design and construct and maintain just about everything you can imagine to get a trail on the ground, these departments have a role in that, whether they're looking at stormwater, or whether they're looking at acquisition techniques, construction methods, et cetera, et cetera. And so I thought that was real impressive and really an important step in collaboration to help Lindsay and Parks and Recreation Department to move these trail projects forward. And so I really enjoyed working with everyone there. We spent a lot of time looking at maps and details and really trying to understand the state of the network today and where we need to go with it. And so we've met 3 times thus far. I think we have another meeting coming up. I might be off by 1 or so there, but I think that's about right to this point. And so I think it's been a really good process and something we'd like to replicate in other places. So really with that 2011 plan, this is effectively what the map looked like. And in most cases, the plan outlined corridors that followed riparian corridors, typically in some cases, rail lines and other types of network connections. And really we're tasked with really trying to get an understand of getting a little bit real. There is a number of plans, and even in addition to what Lindsay mentioned, the city has done a bicycle and pedestrian plan recently and some parks and recreation planning. And so how do we get on top of that and try to get these lines into a little bit better shape in terms of what we think is reasonable to have on the ground? But we also took a look at what we would call redundancy. The city and the transportation department has really been taking some steps forward to right size or retrofit roadways to accommodate bike facilities, also to create a network of bike boulevards throughout the city. And that's a project that's in process as well. And so when you look at those situations and you try to think about how to move a trail program forward with limited resources, we really try to take a look at where we might already be capturing some bicycle and pedestrian trips well enough, and how we might try to focus on greenways where they're more needed across the city. So it's a challenge to look at both the on-road and off-road network and potentially remove some greenway recommendations that we felt like an on-road accommodation might make up for that. In every case, it is a challenge because we know that to get more people biking and walking, we need to get them separated from traffic. And that's really why people flock to shared use paths and trails like we showed in the original slides. People really like that experience of being away from traffic. And so in many cases we had to, make sure we were providing good accommodation, not just a shared lane marking. We may need a trail to parallel that if that was the case. Obviously, a lot of opportunities and constraints out there. There's definitely not the point for you to look at this map in detail, but just to know that we took a look at all the different features from an environmental standpoint, whether that be floodways and floodplains and wetlands, which we always try to avoid as possible. And we obviously looked at private property and right-of-way. It's obviously an important thing to take a look at. The city has a number of properties and parcels across their boundary, also some easements that have been developed and created over time that would provide recreational access. So to the extent that we can, we want to route trails where those publicly owned lands or easements already occurred, so we create less impact to property owners. Obviously, rail lines as well, railroads, and some railroads that might be moving towards abandonment or not being used as much. There might be some opportunities, but they're very often constraints, frankly, getting across railroads, whether you do it at grade or above or below grade, above the rail line. It's a challenge to work with the railroad. And then finally, just those access to destinations and where we're really trying to connect the trail network. So again, we spent a lot of time rehashing the old network. In some cases, we were able to remove some redundancy, some trail lines that were right next to each other. So we removed many of them, but we also found that there were a couple of new connections that we wanted to add to the network where it made sense to connect to what might be a new bike boulevard or to a new development. And so we spent a good bit of time doing that. And then we finally got to the point of making, kind of those recommendations of what are our priority trails. So we ended up with 9 priority trails, and many of those were already defined by DOST and some of the initial work that Lindsay talked about with prioritization. But we had 9 priority trails that we took a very close look at. I'll talk about that here in a minute. We had some key connector trails, so we like to identify those short segments that would make a key connection to a destination or a neighborhood. The network expansion, like I mentioned, as well, where it made sense to expand the trail network a little bit more from the previous plan. But then also what we would call our long-term vision network. And again, that kind of is that long-term network of trails that in many cases might get built with development, like Lindsay mentioned in that toolbox that the city will have, where there can be some requirements for developers in the future potentially to build some of those trails. And so it's good to have it on the plan so that it isn't an adopted plan going forward, and the city might be able to share some of those costs with developers moving forward. So that was a big task in and of itself, I would say. And Lindsay and some of our staff at Alta had a kind of a fun time rolling up the sleeves, and even the committee members, and looking at that overall network and trying to refine it and get it a little more tweaked to what we needed to today. So the next element that we focused on was the strategic corridor feasibility. And this is when we really brought our engineers into the equation a lot more on our side to take a closer look at these priority trails. So we had 9 of them. Like I mentioned, I won't state them all here. These are all of the 9 priority trails that you can take a look at and showing up in those red lines on the map. And, you know, these trails are important for a number of reasons. They are geographically, distributed across the city. They connect in important destinations and help to expand and build out the network. You can kind of make out the American Tobacco Trail and the Ellerby Creek Trail that run really north and south throughout the city. So also trying to connect those other areas that don't have trails, but also to be some spokes off of the Tobacco Trail as well, and ultimately connecting to it. So the feasibility analysis that goes in is pretty significant. You know, like I showed in that overall map before, we have to take a look at a number of different factors when aligning the trail and those 9 priority trails, where they're going to be placed. How do we avoid environmental impacts? How do we, find opportunities to keep in topography that's reasonable for construction and future use, and obviously land ownership. But then also, how do we kind of weigh that against and balance the need to be able to provide convenient access for people, make sure it's safe, make sure it's equitable too. And I think that's an important aspect of what the city of Durham is doing, is how do we make sure we reach our communities, our underserved communities as well. So taking all those things into effect, we really try to take a closer look at where we would get these trails aligned on the ground. So I think I'd more or less just spent some time just talking about that. But I think, what was important for us, again, is the equity again, and making sure that we're providing trails for folks in the community that aren't always able to come out to a public meeting and point to a map and say they'd like to have a trail here or an amenity. And so that was really important for us to take a close look at. And we also wanted to make sure from a funding standpoint, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here in a second, is how is the project going to score? Is it doing all the things it needs to do to score well, to get funding from the state? And some of those funding criteria are access to destinations, connectivity, cost effectiveness, et cetera. So we did site analysis, and that's Aaron and Chris out there from Alta out in the field. And I think it was a good time of year. It was effectively last winter, which is usually a good time to be out, so you're avoiding all the snakes and ticks and mosquitoes. Really walked all 9 of these corridors. I think to some of the corridors we weren't able to walk for various reasons or land ownership reasons, but walked the majority of these corridors. And one nice product that I thought was pretty cool, and I think Lindsay will be able to use a lot in the future, is just being able to do this in Google Earth and being able to drop these points. You can see that map to the right where we have a number of points with text description of what we saw out there, some of the opportunities and constraints, along with a number of photos. So you can drop this right into Google Earth and look at the photos and learn about the corridors. And so it'll be a nice tool for the city moving forward and really help to define how these trails are going to be routed. So when we got into these 9 priority trails, like I mentioned, again, the alignment options, we developed probable costs. I'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute. And did kind of a permitting needs assessment as well, because there really are any number of permits that might be needed at the city, state, or federal level to be able to route a trail. It's not as simple as it may sound. And a developer putting down a 5-foot mulch trail on property they already own away from a creek might be fairly simple, but when we're having to try to fit trails into landscapes, especially where we've already had development, we often have to use these riparian corridors, and there's a whole host of environmental regulations and permits that we have to accomplish. So really tried to dive into detail, and again, take it from that 2011 plan that really was more of the lines on the map down to these 9 projects that will really give the extra level of detail the city is going to need, and hopefully do approximate better cost. Full disclosure, we can develop costs now based on bids we're seeing today, and that's what we're doing for the city. When the city gets ready to build this in 5 years, we don't know what the economy is going to be like, and so there could still be some challenges and cost discrepancies. That's always a challenge, and as you can imagine, as fluid and as our economy is right now, that can change. So I alluded to the scoring earlier, and Lindsay talked about this earlier. To get state funding through the SPOT, which is the state prioritization process, we have to do a number of things to get points. And so one of those things are to connect key destinations, to impact safety. So we're able to route a trail that will create a safer place for bicyclists and pedestrians. And so this is actually a route that wouldn't score so well. If you look at the next slide, if you reroute it, you're connecting more destinations, you're addressing the safety issues more, you're actually connecting existing facilities more. It's going to score a whole lot better. So we try to look through the lens for these 9 priority projects, how and if it's possible to get that scoring. And maybe these are the 2 or 3 or 4 projects of the 9 that will actually do really well and can move forward for that level of funding. So as we broke it down into some of the priority trails, this is just an example of what one looks like. There's a lot of detail in the document, in the draft document, and all those different notes correspond to the different points on the map in terms of what type of challenge you might have, what type of recommended roadway crossing we would have, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of detail there. And this is just a summation of how our SPOT scoring analysis went to get a sense of how some of these projects in theory would score through the SPOT process. We're also able to generate those cost estimates, like I mentioned before, for these segments as well, based on real-time construction bids and data and the analysis. And we effectively did about a 10% design on all of these 9 projects, dropping them into CAD and doing the full analysis from our engineers. And that really helped us to get to this point. So I'm really hopeful it's going to be a really good tool for Lindsay in the future to really kind of take it to that next level of getting it ready for implementation. Which leads to the wrap up. I'm almost done, for those who are wondering, to our implementation program document. And so this is what it looks like, at least a cover and the table of contents. There's something like 200 pages. We're sorry, Lindsay's in the throes of having to review that right now. Hopefully that's good. We have a lot of detail, and it mostly comes around those priority trails, so you can get a lot of that information for each of those corridors. And I think the only other thing I wanted to mention, thus far, without getting into a whole lot of detail, you've already seen some of the detail in the plan just through the priority projects I just mentioned. We talked a lot with Lindsay about how to classify the trail system or how to describe the trail system. We really came to 4 different levels that we really like. And if you think about roadways, it's almost a comparable way of describing trails. So we describe level 1, 2, 3, and 4 as arterial trails, collector trails, neighborhood connectors, and then on-street connectors. And this will just help in defining what we really expect the future use of that trail to be. And arterial is a network spine. In roadway terms, that's a 15501 or an I-40, a major roadway. And for trails, it would be the American Tobacco Trail. And so that's a spine that we anticipate a lot of use in transportation and recreation as well. Collector trails really feed into those arterial trails. And so those have a purpose as well in some of those collector roadways. Or trails in this case, and what does that look like, and how do we make sure we have the right surface and the right type of width and treatment so that we're getting the users to the arterial trails? It really helps us to think about what this system is going to be like. Neighborhood connectors are usually some shorter trail segments that help get you to the collector system. So, and then the on-street, which we have to remember. And we also created some trail details for Lindsay for what we would call street trails, where you have some bikeway or pedestrian amenities, facilities along the trail. And in-street trail, the notion of actually having a shared use path that's really separated by a vertical separator from automobile traffic. So we have to look at an on-street network because, you know, to really get that system level connectivity, we have to have that type of facility as well. And these are some of those details. I know Lindsay showed you one earlier. We provided these for all the different trail types. For Lindsay, I think this is helpful, not just with the developers, but also the different departments across the city that we talked about that served on our committee to really understand the amount of rigor and the amount of detail it needs to go into thinking through what these trails are going to be and how they're going to be designed in the future. So hopefully this will be a nice tool in Lindsay's toolbox to move the city forward as well. So, you know, with that, closing out, we're just delighted to have the opportunity to be virtual with you, I guess recorded in perpetuity. I don't know what that even means, but you'll be able to watch us pretty much anytime. I probably won't be watching myself because I don't like doing that to myself. But if you want to contact us at any time about this project to learn more, feel free to contact us at those email addresses there. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have on the project. I know that this will also be available for questions. You can submit questions actually through the summit. You're probably seeing that information on the screen now where you can contact us through the summit and we'll take a look at the questions that come in and answer questions that way as well. So we just really appreciate y'all listening and excited to move trails forward in Durham.